Mr. Topsy-Turvy was a funny sort of fellow. Everything about him was either upside down or inside out, back to front, topsy-turvy, in fact, which was all very extraordinary. To give you some idea of how topsy-turvy Mr. Topsy-Turvy was, you ought to see his house. The front door is upside down to start with, and the curtains hang upside down at the windows. And just look at that chimney pot. All very extraordinary. Inside is the same. Just look at that clock standing on Mr. Topsy-Turvy's mantelpiece. Isn't that the topsy-turviest clock you've ever seen? And just look at the way Mr. Topsy-Turvy reads a book. Not only does he read it upside down, but he starts to read it at the back page. And just look where Mr. Topsy-Turvy puts the stamp when he sends a letter to somebody. You ever seen anything like it? Now, this story is all about the time Mr. Topsy-Turvy came to the town where you and I live. Nobody's quite sure how Mr. Topsy-Turvy got there, or where he came from. But he did arrive because somebody saw him getting off the train. The trouble was, he did it in a topsy-turvy way. Which really isn't all that surprising, is it? Mr. Topsy-Turvy went to a hotel to find a room to spend the night. The hotel manager tried not to smile when he saw Mr. Topsy-Turvy walk into his hotel carrying his suitcase upside down and with his topsy-turvy hat on his head. "Good afternoon, sir," he said. "Can I help you?" Now, something you didn't know about Mr. Topsy-Turvy is the way he speaks. You see, he sometimes gets things the wrong way round. "Afternoon, good," said Mr. Topsy-Turvy to the hotel manager. I'd room alike." The manager scratched his head. "You mean you'd like a room?" he asked. "Please, yes," replied Mr. Topsy-Turvy. Eventually, the hotel manager managed to work out what Mr. Topsy-Turvy was talking about, and he was taken up in the lift to a bedroom. Then Mr. Topsy-Turvy unpacked a suitcase, put on his pajamas, and went to bed. He was rather tired after travelling from wherever he'd come from. The following day, Mr. Topsy-Turvy went round the town. But what a fuss his going round the town caused. He took a taxi from the hotel, but so confused the taxi driver trying to tell him where he wanted to go, the poor man drove straight into a traffic light. "Oh, dear," said Mr. Topsy-Turvy. "I am sorry, very." Then he went into a big department store in the middle of the town. Walked up to one of the counters. "I'd like a sock of pears," he said to the lady behind the counter. "You mean a pair of socks?" she smiled, and showed him a pair of bright red socks. Mr. Topsy-Turvy put them on his hands. Then he tried to leave. But being Mr. Topsy-Turvy, he tried to walk down the up escalator, and all the people who were going up the up escalator all fell over themselves. Oh, it was a terrible topsy-turvy jumble. That day, Mr. Topsy-Turvy did all sorts of topsy-turvy things. Then he went to an art gallery and insisted on hanging all the pictures upside down so that he could look at them properly. And then, after Mr. Topsy-Turvy had been in the town for just one day, he disappeared. Nobody knew how he went, where he went, but he certainly went because he wasn't there anymore. The whole town breathed a sigh of relief. But what the town discovered, even though Mr. Topsy-Turvy had left, was that everything was still topsy-turvy. Read all it about, shouted the newspaper sellers. Instead of shouting, read all about it. News is the here, said the television newsreader, instead of saying, here is the news. Morning good, people started saying to each other when they met him. Do you how, instead of how do you do? Everybody was talking topsy-turvy. Now can you think of something to say that's topsy-turvy? Try on, go. I mean, go on, try. Mr. Impossible could do the most amazing things. For instance, he could jump over a house. Impossible. And Mr. Impossible could make himself invisible. All he had to do was to stand there and think about becoming invisible, and he became invisible. Impossible. And Mr. Impossible could fly. All he had to do was stand there and flap his arms about, and off he flew. Impossible. He lived in an impossible-looking house. Have you ever seen a house in such an impossible place? Of course not. One day, he was out walking in the woods when he met a boy called William. William was on his way to school. Hello there, said Mr. Impossible. Hello, said William. I'm William. I'm impossible. Really? Said William. Sure am, smiled Mr. Impossible. Could you do impossible things? Asked William. Haven't come across anything I couldn't do. William thought. Can you climb up that tree? He asked, pointing to the biggest tree in the wood. Oh, I can do better than that, replied Mr. Impossible. I can walk up that tree. And he did. William thought again. Can you stand on one hand? He asked. Well, I can do better than that, replied Mr. Impossible. I can stand on no hands. And he did. That's impossible, cried William. Sure is, replied Mr. Impossible. Then William remembered that he was on his way to school. Why don't you come with me? He asked. But I've never been to school before. Then it's time you did, replied William. Come. William and Mr. Impossible sat at the back of William's classroom with all the other children. The teacher came in, but didn't notice that there was somebody extra in his class that morning. "Morning, children," he said. "I have a very difficult sum for you to do today. It will take you most of the morning to work out the answer." And he wrote the sum. It really was the most difficult sum William had ever seen in his whole life, full of adding up and taking away, and multiplications and divisions, and other things William didn't enjoy. The teacher was right. It would indeed take up most of the morning to work out the answer, if not most of the afternoon as well. Mr. Impossible whispered in William's ear. William put up his hand. "Yes, William?" "Teacher, is there something about the sum that you don't understand?" "Please, sir," said William, "is the answer 23? Teacher was very, absolutely, totally, completely amazed. "How did you work out the sum so quickly?" he gasped. "It's impossible." "Ain't nothing impossible, mister," said Mr. Impossible from the back of the class, and stood up. "Well, I never did," exclaimed the teacher. After that, Mr. Impossible spent all day at the school. He showed the teacher how he could read a book upside down. "But that's impossible," said the children who were watching. "Yes, sir," said Mr. Impossible. Then William asked Mr. Impossible if he'd like to play in the school football match. "Sure would," replied Mr. Impossible, "but I ain't never played football before." You know what he did? He kicked the football so high into the air that when it came down it had snow on it. Impossible. Then it was time to go home. Mr. Impossible said goodbye to all the people at school, and then he said goodbye to William. "Goodbye, Mr. Impossible," said William. "So long, William," said Mr. Impossible. Just disappeared. William rubbed his eyes and went home. William's mother and father were waiting for him. "Hello, William," they said. "You have a good day at school?" "Yes," he replied. "And I met someone who can do anything in the world." Oh, really, William?" They both laughed. "You're impossible." William smiled and went inside. And 100 miles away, a small figure was listening to what William's mother and father were saying. And then he went to sleep, standing on his head. And we all know that that is downright impossible. Yes, sir. Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But, achoo! When Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now, this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in bed. His bedroom, there's his house. He's on top of the hill. He was snoring. And as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noise's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. Sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up. And so too did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. The door wobbled. The house wobbled. The whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high wobbled. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. He walked into the baker's shop. "I'd like a loaf of bread," boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb